Hey guys, today we're going to take a look at the next section here in our period 7 unit, and last time we talked about imperialism, and today we're going to take a look at progressive era. And throughout this progressive era, we're going to take a look at a bunch of urban and social reforms that are going to take place, and think about it's easy to remember this as far as the root word of the progressive era is progress. This idea of people who want to try to progress and they want to try to reform and they want to try to change the way that society looks at this point. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we can connect period 6 with the Gilded Age to the progressive era. It's important to keep in mind, we want to try to focus on what were some of the problems that were existing during this time period. And first thing we want to take a look at is the industrialization factor. The idea that because of this urbanization and immigration, this push and pull factors that bring either American migrants from the rural parts and also immigrants coming over from parts of Europe and Asia, the cities are growing very rapidly. This led to a lot of poverty in these large areas, these tenement buildings that we saw that were very overcrowded, that were unsanitary, that were small, dangerous areas, and even also the dangerous working conditions. We also talked about how under the political realm, there's a lot of corruption happening, whether it was in the first picture, we talked about like the political machines like Boss Tweed and the Tammany Hall incidents in New York, where these machines had so much influence and so much corruptions over the city and state officials. And then we also talked the same thing about the during the Gilded Age, that these mega business owners like the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, and so forth, it seemed as though they had an influence over the federal government and state governments as well to try to create these laissez-faire policies and make sure that they were pro-business. And with this, these corporate monopolies are kind of limiting competition and also worker wages. So even though the standard of living is going up for most, there are still some of those who are lower and who are struggling during this time period. So that's where we're kind of looking at progressives are trying to progress and trying to change culture, trying to reform the society, and trying to, in their way, improve it for the better. So one of the big progressive ideas that are coming out of this time period is called the social gospel movement, and this is think about what these two words mean, social and then the word gospel. And when we think about gospel, think about when we talk about Carnegie, his gospel of wealth, that it plays on the idea of religion and it has to do with God and Christianity. And the social gospel is kind of saying that society needed to be helped and reformed, and that others must be brought together to be helped in order to praise God and be able to reform the society and honor God. So someone like Jane Addams is going to be an early reformer for this, who's going to create in especially the city of Chicago. She's going to work as a progressive reformer to try to bring about changes in slums and tenements, trying to work on things like child labor, and they will try to extinct things like political corruption, prostitution, and things like this. Again, remember, the progressive era is trying to progress society, trying to reform it, trying to change it. And with Jane Addams, her Hull House, which was the first one in Chicago, was really the first kind of settlement house to offer charitable goods or charitable actions to the poor of Chicago, offering health care, child care, cheap food, a place to sleep, place to clean, all these things that maybe they were not able to do on their own are able to, she's doing this as a way to help reform. And with this, with Jane Addams' efforts, it's going to inspire all over the country, these places, these settlement houses. And one of these examples is ones that we can still see even today, which was the YMCA. And often urban areas for reformers, for whether it be for young men or children, these YMCA's were created for gyms, libraries, things to help young men. And then eventually the YWCA was then also used for women. We know that the Salvation Army was created as nurseries and soup kitchens, and now has kind of transformed into a place for people to give donations for clothing or for household goods and so forth to help out the underprivileged as well. One of the also things that we talked about during the Gilded Age was a high level of child labor, and we can see that in the picture there at the bottom. Florence Kelley, one of the progressive reformers as well, is going to work to create labor laws across multiple states to help to limit the hour of days and also to eliminate the amount of hours that children can work as well, and also the age of when children can work. One of the issues too that's going to be very prominent during the progressive era is going to be the idea of alcohol abuse. And this is seen as kind of a huge problem across the country. Alcohol rates are at a much higher rate than they are today. In some areas where water was unclean, it was really sometimes the only thing that people could drink. But especially for men, middle-aged men, young-aged men, this is what they would do, and oftentimes they would even go to work inebriated. So imagine working in a factory, being intoxicated, and what kind of dangers that could lie. So this saloon lifestyle was seen as very dangerous, and there was a huge temperance movement that was passed as a way to try to reduce that. They believed that the women that were part of the temperance movement believed that alcohol was the reason for high crime rates, high corruption rates. It would help to, it also made it difficult for immigrants to assimilate because they were drinking all the time. So the reformers movement led by Carrie Nation and Frances Willard, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was meant to try to fight alcohol, was meant to try to push for prohibition laws. Carrie Nation herself was more of a violent or using aggression to get her way. Stories of going into places like in Kansas City and in Missouri where they would tear up and they would destroy, they would cause damage to saloons to kind of protest and to stand for their movements that they wanted to get rid of alcohol. They believe that as a dry nation, society would improve. So you can see then that as the movement grows, that in different areas there are statewide prohibitions. So we think of usually the federal level of prohibition with the 18th Amendment, but however before that there were certain states that were considered dry, and you can see here some of the different years when a statewide prohibition came into place. So you can just see here as an example, North Carolina, 1909, and some places going all the way back to the 1880s or even the 1850s in Maine. So these movements, and here's just kind of a map showing dry and wet counties as well, that there were areas that were even, that was just based on the county, not the entire state. Eventually in 1919, the 18th Amendment will outlaw officially the use of alcohol. And we'll get into later in our unit, we'll talk about the idea of prohibition in the 1920s and the idea of speakeasies and whether it was truly followed or not, and how it kind of led to even more crime and so forth and more corruption in the government. So it kind of had the counter effect of what the temperance movement leaders wanted. Another important piece here of the progressive era with these social reforms is going to be what's known as muckrakers. And these are investigative journalists, people who are trying to find truth. And they might be investigating things like corruption in government. They might be investigating things of poverty, healthcare. It could be the food industry. Jacob Riis is going to be a muckraker who writes a book in 1890 called How the Other Half Lives, kind of exposing the true rates of poverty that some of these cities saw. And you can see here some of the images of taken kind of showing around the Panic of 1893 what it was like to be part of the lowest class of people in these major metropolitan areas. Ida Tarbell is going to be another muckraker who really tries to investigate the business practices of John Rockefeller and the Standard Oil monopolies. And we talked before about how these trusts would go, from practicing horizontal integration, they would go and they would, use pressure to buy out all competitors, and that these holding trusts would kind of make sure that the business always maintained a near or up to an absolute monopoly on the oil industry. So the solution then to Ida Tarbell, she would say, to break up these large monopolies, or to try to get rid of these ruthless business practices of horizontal integration, where you're going to break up these large monopolies into smaller set companies who are competing to try to hopefully allow for a better marketplace for the consumer. Eventually we'll get to, when we get to Roosevelt and Taft, the progressive presidents, the true trust busters, they're going to be the ones who break up these large companies and these large monopolies into smaller set companies. One of the more famous, or maybe infamous would be the better word, examples of muckrakers would be Upton Sinclair, writing a book called The Jungle, about the meat packing plants and the disgusting and awful things that were going into the sausage factories that were being produced in these major metropolitan areas. We're actually going to take a deeper look into the jungle and see some of the things that are coming through with this. But with Upton Sinclair, his hopes was to try to bring knowledge to what was happening as far as workers and factories and the corruption within the business practices, or kind of the divide between workers and managers. However, people more focused on the idea of the food industry and the unsanitary conditions, and it led to eventually the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which put standards for what food has to be met by companies and what they can and cannot do to their food. There will also be rights, there will be movements for equal women's rights as far as voting, divorce laws in certain states where they cannot do so, owning property, owning businesses. We obviously will know, we'll talk about the 19th Amendment being passed with giving women suffrage. So these are all things that are kind of stemming from the progressive era as well. Again, in most cases, they could not divorce or own property, and that's going to be things that are going to be changed. And the women's movement is really kind of pushed later on as not, and this is not done in a racial sense, but the fact that they see that uneducated black men or illiterate black men are getting the right to vote under the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, and they're sitting around wondering, well, why can't we have the right to vote as well? We've also talked before about how in certain industries that women were paid less than men, so wanting to kind of earn the equal pay as well, and this expectation of being women as mothers, kind of the early forms of feminism movements, are going to be kind of pushed here that women should be able to do more things outside of just the home, but also to outside of raising a family, but able to find a career or able to obtain a job in other facets as well. So from these feminism movements, we get to there's more ideas about personal rights for women. Women begin finding new jobs and so forth in the major cities. They end up graduating from high school at higher rates, starting to attend universities at higher rates, and graduating from universities at higher rates to the point where even today, if we look at university demographics, women actually make up a larger percentage of college graduates than men do. And during the Progressive Era, a lot of women, kind of motivated by this feminist movement and trying to create reforms for society, they played a lot of important roles, whether it be Jane Addams, again, with the first settlement houses and trying to create charitable standards for the poor to help them out and kind of leading to the creation of the Salvation Army and the YMCA. Ida Tarbell exposing for corruption and monopolies is trying to kind of break up business practices by the federal government, and then the temperance movements done by Florence Kelley and Carrie Nation. Feminists will also work to create laws that ban prostitution across different state lines, and Margaret Sanger is going to work, and this is where really kind of the first idea of women controlling birth and having birth control accessible to them is going to be created, where she will create the first Planned Parenthood, as well the first clinic in major cities to try to help promote that as well. And with this, one of the other significant reforms is going to be the idea for women's suffrage. And the Seneca Falls Convention is going to be the first one, which we've briefly talked about in our timelines in period 5, where they kind of demanded property and voting rights. But it's not going to really take place until we get to the Progressive Era in the early 1900s. Again, women are going to be kind of motivated and frustrated when they see that men are able to gain universal voting rights under the 15th Amendment, but women did not. So Susan Anthony Elizabeth Stanton are working to create the women's suffrage movement, the National American Women's Suffrage Movement, to try to promote for this. Now, it is important to keep in mind that even though that this is a huge reform and is a huge movement for women, it's actually, it was not universally accepted by women. Actually, there's a majority of women, I believe about 55 to 60% of women itself did not want the right to vote because they did not want the responsibilities of citizenship that came with the voting rights, as far as potentially a draft or kind of what's called bucket duty or so forth, or things where, in times of crisis, where you would have to step up and you would have to kind of help to the city, where police or firefighting duties and things like that. So it was kind of a controversial issue even within the women's community, as far as whether or not to give them the right to vote. Eventually, by 1920, then the 19th Amendment will be ratified, giving the right to vote to all women, regardless of sex. And you can see the Constitution there, the amendment to it there, the 19th Amendment, in the article here, showing that it cannot be abridged by any state or on the account of sex. The Progressive Era is also going to be kind of working to try to demand equal rights by African Americans, or for African Americans. We will see different examples of this. We talked about already how a lot of the South was still, or a lot of the freely black men are still living in the South, mostly as sharecroppers, and that kind of created the system of enslavement even without slavery, because they could not get themselves out of it. These literacy tests were being created, and polling taxes were created to kind of restrict black voting in certain areas. Jim Crow laws were being created in the South because of state governments who were creating these things based off the court case of Plessy versus Ferguson, that declared segregation was constitutional and was allowed because it did not violate the 14th Amendment as long as things were separate but equal. And then with this, unfortunately, we do know that violence was very common. The beginnings of the KKK were created, and that it was very commonplace for different laws to be enacted differently, or different punishments to be enacted differently based on the ideas of race, and white and black.